Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube podcast. Today, it's just going to be visually, it'll just be me, but we're joined by the one, the only Amy Welborn, but only via audio due to technical things. And so I just want to say thank you, Amy, for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you, Larry, for inviting me very much.
Yes, many of my listeners probably know who Amy Wellborn is. But Amy is a well-known blogger. You've been blogging since I think around 2000, year 2000, 2001, something like
Yeah, it
that.
was 2001. It was actually the week of September 11th. I wasn't inspired by that, but that's just what happened. And that's how I remember it.
Yes, indeed. And you do a lot of freelance writing too and stuff. And so yeah, just everybody knows the one, the only Amy Wellborn. And for some of my viewers understand, I mean, Amy and I have been reading each other's stuff for several years, but we finally met in person last fall at a conference at Notre Dame in South Bend
Right.
with my wife Carrie, who says hi, by the way.
Oh, hello.
And then, of course, Amy and I were just in Rome. I was there for almost the whole month of May, covering first the papal funeral, then the conclave, then the inauguration mass of Pope Leo, and so. But you were there for the conclave, uh, right? You were there for the
Oh,
conclave. Yeah,
of
yeah,
course, yes.
the white smoke, the whole thing. Well,
Yes.
the memory gives. I didn't know because you were only there like 4 or 5 days.
Right. Yeah.
I couldn't quite remember. Were you there when the white? Well, of course you were. Yeah,
Yeah, of
absolutely you were.
course. We stood and watched the black smoke. Yeah.
Yeah, we watched the black smoke together, and it's
Right.
but before I get to your thoughts on this, I mean, it is funny. We were also expecting more black smoke on the day, the evening that the white smoke came out at like 6 p.m.
Right.
On Thursday. I was actually just off St. Peter's Square at a little bar having a Negroni with a friend.
Oh, really? I didn't
Yeah.
know that.
Yeah, and because we thought, oh, it's going to be black smoke again. It's going to be black smoke. So about a 10 to 6, we thought, well, let's wander back in. And there was a line at that point, and we got on the line. And just as right before we were to get in through security, the crowd just erupted with enormous cheers. So the Cardinals had jumped the gun. The smoke wasn't supposed to come out till about 7 p.m., but I guess they decided early. And so we knew. So we got in, and there was the white smoke
Ah.
pouring out. So, any rate, so I wanted to first off turn it over to you now. I want you to, in a sense, just give your overall Amy Wellborn take, your Amy Wellborn impressions of what. I had an article in Catholic World Report on this, the what I thought the significance, not just of Pope Leo's election, but just the significance of how the Catholic Church elects a pope, which I think is fascinating, the symbolism of it all. But anyway, you can comment anyway. What were your thoughts on the conclave in your time in Rome?
Well, I mean, first of all, just a little background. I had not planned to go, of course. It's kind of weird thinking back on it just a month ago that I was in the process of driving a car out to one of my sons, who is in college way out west. And I had delivered
Wyoming
the car.
Catholic College, right?
Yes, yes. And I had was there and was going to come back that night, come back to Alabama. And I had, I knew the conclave was coming. Of course, I was following it, but it hadn't even occurred to me for like 1 second to um to go, that I could go or that I should go. I had
Yeah.
another trip bookending it. I was going to be in New York the next weekend. And then I woke up that Sunday morning and I started, reading all the feeds. I probably read your stuff. I read a bunch of people who were in Rome, and it just like hit me. It's like, why am I not going to Rome? I can do this. And I looked at airfare from New York. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't terrible at all. And so I went ahead and arrived and got home in Alabama at 10:30 at night that night. took a plane 6 a.m. Monday morning and was in Rome on Tuesday and left on Saturday. I was trusting that the Cardinals would do their job by Saturday by the time I left. I was hoping and praying.
Yeah.
I wasn't there for the whole month like you are. So it was a totally unexpected thing. And it was the usual experience when you go to Rome is that you see all sorts of people like you and many others that or know online, you meet them in person and so on and so forth. It's a real homecoming for Catholics. And it's a real sense of being at home when you are in Rome. And so I was actually in the square when the white smoke came out. And here's what I experienced was I'm in the middle of all these people. Most of them are a lot of Filipinos, a big group from Mexico, no other Americans at all around me or North Americans. And the white smoke came out. And of course, the place just erupted. People were crying and cheering and
Yeah.
singing and just ecstatic. And it hit me just so forcefully. We don't even know who the Pope is. We don't even know who this guy is, but people are just joyful. And then, we have to wait an hour, right? And the cardinal comes out and says, with great joy, Habemus Papam. Again, just the place explodes. But we still don't know who it is, right? We still
Right.
don't know there's that period of time, a minute or so, when we don't know who the new pope is, but the church gathered there is still filled with joy and I want to say love, right? Love
Yes.
for whoever it is, because and it's a love not based on the personal qualities because we don't know who it is. It's love based on the fact that this is the vicar of Christ. This is the successor of Peter. The fact that we have a pope, that Abemus Papam, is a sign of God's love for us. I mean, that's what it is. It's like
That's right.
Jesus promised he would be with us, and he is, and we explode with joy and love um, in this moment. And it also hit me then and afterwards with great force as I observed Leo coming out on the balcony, observed his affect, his demeanor when he came out. Um, and I thought, for someone to be in this position, to be, elected Pope, and to look out and to hear the response and the love that people have for you, but to know it's not about you, and in actual humility, to know that it's about ultimately Christ, to take that and to, I don't know, misuse that love and that affection and that sort of authority you're being given to act in Christ's name, to misuse it is sad, as our
Yeah.
president
Yeah.
would say. Um, and so it was just, I think, if anything, I took away in a very powerful, direct way from that moment, from being at St. Peter's Square when the white smoke came out. It was a kind of a deeper understanding of the complexity and the tension in church leadership between the specific qualities of a person in leadership, but then kind of the fact that they are acting in, not for themselves, but for the people of God and in the name of God. And the kind of the balancing act that is required there to keep that straight in your head as a person in authority, to understand and to act with true humility, um, knowing that it's not about you.
That's right. It isn't about you or me or the new pope.
Right.
Along the like three things here. First, I agree. I have great hope in Pope Leo, and I'll ask your opinion on Pope Leo in a second. Pope Leo,
Mm-hmm.
the close up of him on the loggia, uh, of choking back tears,
Oh,
I think says a lot about the fact that he appreciates the office. In other words,
right.
I think he was overwhelmed, not just with a sense of responsibility. They weren't tears of sadness. I think
Right,
they were tears of choking back tears of giftedness, just
right,
a powerful awareness of the moment, of how the office transcends the person, and what a powerful act of humility is required of anyone who's elected to the papacy, that they have to lose themselves in the office. But a couple
right.
of other things. First, you say Rome is like a coming home. I could not agree more. Uh, I think that any Catholic who goes to Rome and comes back and says, "I hate Rome," uh, is insane. Isn't much of a Catholic or something, or maybe they had a bad experience there or something. But Rome really is the mother church of Catholicism. I mean, for Jerusalem and all that, the Holy Land, yes. But for Catholics,
Mhm.
I think Rome has a special appeal. It is really in my opinion, the greatest city in the world. And I'm biased because I'm a Catholic, but I think every Catholic, I hopefully will at some point have an opportunity to go there and experience it. But second, you said that first off, there were a lot of Filipinos there in the square. I wonder. I mentioned in my Catholic Order Part article that I was standing next to three Filipino sisters,
Yeah,
religious sisters, and that one of them was jumping up and down, like you said, and crying and weeping after the Habemus Papam thing. And I thought, oh, okay. So things calmed down just a bit, and I turned to her because she spoke English.
yeah.
And I said, "Oh, what do you know about Cardinal Prevost?" And she looked at me and she goes, "Who?"
Ah.
She
Right.
didn't know who Cardinal
Yeah,
Prevost was. She didn't even know that's who had been elected. And
right.
so I agree with you completely, Amy. I was struck at that moment by here. I had been in meetings for a week or two with George Weigel and other journalists and so forth, discussing various
Names.
papabile and
Yeah, right.
possibilities and this guy and that guy and, who we wanted, who we didn't want.
Right,
And I'm sitting there and I heard Prevost and I'm going, I don't know. I don't know much about the guy.
right.
Blah, blah, blah. And then I got that response from that religious sister, and I thought I felt humbled. I felt, oh, geez,
Yeah,
I should have that same sense of joy that she has that we've just elected a new pope.
right.
But anyway, let's move on then to Pope Leo. Like I said, I didn't know much about Pope Leo at first, but I've
No.
come to know more. My initial impression is, we have to yet and see his personnel appointments, his decisions, his policies.
Hmm.
But so far, I'm very, very much in love with, not just impressed with, but I'm in love with Pope Leo. I think he's going to be a powerful and tremendous Pope. That's my prediction.
I agree. And I have been trying not to become a fangirl of Pope Leo because,
Yeah,
again, that kind of goes against what I just said about, oh, the person isn't shouldn't be that important and all that kind of thing is the office. But the fact is, an individual human being does hold that office. And I agree with you. I think that his papacy promises to be very consequential. He, first of all, because of his personal affect and the fact that what everybody says about him, and you can even tell by looking at him, is that he's a listener, he's reserved, he doesn't react, he acts, he takes things into consideration. I think that is essential for any kind of leadership role, but especially when you're leading a billion Catholics from all over the world. So I think that is going to play a part in it. But everything that he has done and everything that he has said, and the few homilies and speeches that he's given so far, indicate to me just this great, I want to say, delicacy of language, of first of all being rooted in tradition, understanding that is who we are and that is where we come from, not seeking to create new things or anything like that, but to simply start with who we are as tradition. And we can see that from what he's wearing and even from the content of his homilies and speeches in which he makes continual allusions to church fathers, scripture, and so on, not just relying on his own views or
right.
something very recent or something like that. And what I have it just seems to me it's a kind of a recentering that we're seeing, even already seeing, and the fact that he reaches out. There was a last Saturday night there was a rosary in Vatican Gardens, and you can look this up on Vatican News. And he shows up at the end to give a little fervorino, a little talk to the people gathered. I think they're probably mostly Vatican employees, and he is wearing his mazzetta and a stole that had been given to him, I think, by the Bulgarian that he had met with earlier in the week. And he gives this very sweet speech. He goes down among the employees and talks to them, and there is just not this sense of I mean, there's just, as I said, it's true humility. It's true kind of presence with others. And so I think that those reasons, but also the fact, and I'm sure we're going to get more into this, his experience. And this is, I think, essential, is that born American, raised American, decades doing missionary work in Peru, working in Rome, he's kind of seen it all. And he's got, it seems to me, a very holistic understanding of where the church is today. From that American background, but then the state of the church in South America, in the third world, in developing countries. What I think what it does is that it helps a person understand priorities and what's important and what's not, and that deep understanding of people who live on the edge, as well as his understanding of the American church and the church in the West. I think it's just kind of what we need.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think that's a very good assessment. Kind of what we need is exactly
Right.
how I would sum it up. In some ways, too, not to get too overly worldly about this, but the Vatican is currently in a bit of a financial crisis. It's
Exactly.
running like an $80 million deficit this year or whatever. And one of the reasons for that, for whatever reason, is that the American Catholic Church, which has long been a financial, gravy train for the Vatican,
Mm-hmm.
the donations from the American Church to the Vatican over the past 12 years, essentially during the reign of Pope Francis, have cratered, have just
Right.
absolutely plummeted. Could be, Pope Francis made a habit of insulting Americans, and, so, maybe that has something to do with it. But at any rate, so yeah, I'm thinking the Cardinals are sitting there thinking maybe it'd be a good idea to have an American, and then they look at Prevost, and they think this is like the best of all the worlds because Prevost
Right.
is an American, but kind of not. In the sense, he's an
Right.
American by birth and upbringing, but
Right.
since he entered religious life. He was in Peru for 20 years. He has dual citizenship with Peru.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very, very clear that he's more a citizen of the world than he is a
Exactly.
citizen of America, even though he is an American. And so that's the kind of what strikes me is that his he doesn't repudiate his American heritage. He celebrates it. He is clearly not anti-American or un-American, but it's also
Right.
very clear he's a very particular kind of American.
Mm-hmm.
He is a Catholic American who was at one time the head of a religious order and a missionary, and therefore also a citizen of the world. And that is one of the things that I first get a sense of now in this papacy is
Mm-hmm.
a sense he's constantly talking about the need for unity, unity, unity. And
Mm-hmm.
this is very, very, very encouraging to me. And not just because the church is global, and
Mm-hmm.
he's a citizen of the world, but theologically, in my point of view, as I've said many times, I think that the essential feature of the Petrine ministry is that it's a court of last appeal. That the Pope simply, his chief function is to unify the church by clarifying matters of dispute
Right.
and not to be a micromanager. So his constant references to unity, 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 I think speaks directly to the heart of what the Petrine ministry is supposed to be. And so
Mm-hmm.
that kind of gives me gives me hope. Anyway, you can comment on what I've just said, or if you want to add something to it, go ahead.
Yeah, and I find the generational aspect of this interesting and worth watching as well. He's 69, so he's basically our generation. He's a little
Yeah,
older than we are, a few years.
yeah, yeah.
He went to Catholic Theological Union. I mean, not Catholic. Is it Chicago or Catholic Theological Union in Chicago?
Just Chicago Theological
Yeah, it's
Union.
Chicago Theological Union.
Most theological unions are not really Catholic. They're a
That's
conglomeration of
right.
all kinds of things.
That's right.
Anyway,
And
go
that's
ahead.
that's where he went. And I have to tell you the story. So I was at Mass, not in Birmingham, not in Charlotte, North Carolina, which has been a big topic of conversation this week, um, but in another city in the South a week and a half ago, last Sunday. And the priest who celebrated was in his mid 70s. And it was what you might expect, right? Kind of freewheeling and all of that
Yeah.
kind of thing. And he preached, his homily was as long as the rest of Mass put together, that kind of thing. And this is not to disparage him as a priest. He has, in his 50 years probably of ministry, he's helped zillions of people, far more than I could ever hope to, and been with them in their suffering and joy and so on. But okay, he in his homily he preached on the Council of Jerusalem and said, "Well, how is the Holy Spirit active in the church today?" And he said, "Here's how it is. We just had a conclave and we just elected a pope. That's how the Holy Spirit is active in the church today." And then he went on to talk about his background, speaking about how he was a kind of teenager during the Second Vatican Council, and it was the best thing that ever happened to the church. And it was fantastic that he left sixth grade school at sixth grade, and they were chanting in Latin. And then he came back to school in seventh grade, and they were having mass in English. And John the 23rd was his pope. He loved John the 23rd. Great. And then he said, "Oh, right," in his homily in mass, he said, "I didn't think too much of the next two popes." I mean, he didn't mean Paul VI or John Paul I. He meant John Paul II and Benedict XVI. He
Yeah,
said, "I
yeah.
didn't think much of them, but I love Francis. And I'm confident, I really hope that in Leo, the Spirit has given us a pope in the line of Francis, not the other guys."
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
Yeah. I mean, he said this.
Wow. So let's get this straight. The Holy Spirit was active in electing Prevost, but not in electing Wojtyła or Ratzinger. Uh,
Exactly. Isn't that
got it.
funny how
Got it
that
straight.
works?
So, in other words, the Holy Spirit is active when it agrees with Father Shimishang, uh,
Right.
and the Holy Spirit is not active when Father Shimishang is
That's
been contradicted by the Holy Spirit.
that's right. And so I mean it's very interesting to me. And so and the reason I bring it up is because he specifically said that when he didn't know much about Prevost, but he heard that he went to CTU in the the period that he went in the 70s, and that's a good sign. So
Maybe it is Catholic Theological Union. I don't know.
because
Chicago
there's the
Catholic.
one in DC, which, and I can't remember what that is, but anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
um
Anyway, I stand corrected. It might be
yeah.
Catholic Theological
So
Union.
anyway,
I don't know.
he saw the fact that Prevost had gone there in the 70s as a sign of
Well, it's a very liberal place. It's a very liberal
it
place.
was. And so that's what I'm saying. I'm really interested to see how that plays out in his papacy. It Francis was very, very much obviously a product of his time in all kinds of ways. I mean, you could just watch him and read him and say, yeah, this is where this comes from. This is where this comes from, for good or
Well,
for ill. He's either acting consistent with it or reacting against it.
yeah, I'm
And
60. Oh, I'm sorry. I interrupted
no,
you.
and I was going to say, I'm interested since Prevost kind of came of age in the American church in this period of transition and was theologically trained in the United States. I mean, he went, I mean, not in theology, but he went to Villanova and then to the Augustinian Seminary and CTU, all in this period. I'm interested to see how that plays out in his
Yeah,
thinking.
and in Villanova's theology department, since the council's never been known to be a bulwark of
Right,
orthodox, it's better than some. Let's put it that
right.
way. I have friends down there and stuff, so I don't want to trash talk the place.
Well, and
and
I have
Villanova.
a good friend that I do my own podcast with, or actually it's his podcast, Chris Barnett.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, so he is a professor emeritus at Villanova. He lives in Birmingham, but he still works with Villanova,
yeah.
teaches and advises, and so on. He's a Kierkegaard scholar as well as other things.
There's
But
good people there like Kevin Hughes and others. Yeah,
right, right. And interestingly enough, if you recall when we were in St. Peter's Square, when you're in a square with a space with tens of thousands of people and something happens and everybody wants to communicate that event, the service, internet service just goes down. There's no Wi-Fi. You can't do it. And so my story about the new pope was that, he says, Habemus Papam, and then he says, Roberto, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, who? And I had no idea what he said.
yeah.
He said Roberto, and I thought, Sarah? No, surely not. And I didn't know anybody's, first name. So I'm like, for several minutes, I'm just wondering who is the Pope? I don't know who it was elected. And finally, very kind of entertainingly, through this mess of no service, I get a text from the United States from Chris Barnett that says Prevost exclamation point, and that's, oh, okay, that's who the Pope is.
Robert. Yeah, I thought the
Yeah,
same thing when I heard what about. I thought, oh my God, it's Cardinal Sarah, Cardinal Sarah, and then I heard, I did hear Prevost, and I didn't catch because the cheering started. I didn't catch the name he had adopted. I didn't
Leo.
catch Leo. I had to figure that out later, but I
Right,
did catch Prevost. But to go back to the generational question, I think
right.
is an important one. I'm 66, Pope 69, so it's 3 years separate, but it's essentially the same generation.
Right.
And what's interesting, I thought the same thing when I saw, oh gosh, he went to Theological Union in Chicago. During that time, it was just a fun factory of craziness,
Right.
and seriously, just really awful stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Where actually what was being taught wasn't theology at all, but
Mm-hmm.
sociology, psychology, philosophical deconstructionism, all of them applied to issues of race and economics. It was very Marxist. It just was silly. And so when I first saw he went there, I thought, oh, geez, that's bad. But on the other hand, having gone through the 70s and early 80s myself, first college, then seminary, the fact is, if you were a person of a more Orthodox Catholic persuasion, you saw through the mess. You
Right.
saw through it and you just endured it. And it's like when I went to Fordham for my PhD and it was just a hotbed of liberal Runarianism. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
fight it. I said, well, I'm just going to learn from them
Mm-hmm.
liberal Runarianism. Meanwhile,
Right.
I'm going to read a whole bunch of stuff on my own, namely Balthasar, Ratzinger, de Lubac. I'm just
Right.
going to, autodidact, read a whole, after all, PhD mostly is autodidact. So, I think there's a very, very good chance that Roberto Francesco Prevoste probably did the same thing. He flew
Yeah.
under the radar. I'm not saying he's a closet trad. He's
No.
not.
No.
But what I think is he's more in the mold of JP2 and Benedict than I think the pro Francis crowd would like to admit. In other words, that there's a reason why he's not Francesco II, even though that
Right.
would have been a very, very easy thing to do for him to simply
Yeah.
adopt Francis II. Okay, we're going to have continuity with the previous papacy. So the choice of Leo, I think, is very significant. He's
Mm-hmm.
saying, I'm going to be my own man. I'm going to be a person committed to social justice and the social teachings of the church. Hence, I choose
Right.
Leo. But I'm also, in other words, I think it's very shrewd, Amy, and I want your comment on this. In not choosing to be John the 24th
Right.
or Paul the 7th or John Paul the 3rd or Benedict the 17th or even a Francis the 2nd, he's deliberately bypassing the internal politics of the post that generational thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think he has a tremendous understanding of the need for unity in the church, how the 70s in particular undermined. That kind of progressive Catholicism undermines the church, but also radical traditionalist Catholicism undermines the unity of the church. And so he bypasses all of that internal politics and reaches back into the 19th century and says, this is the guy that I want to model my papacy after. I thought that it was a brilliant move on his part.
Yeah, and I agree. And speaking of, the internal politics of the church and bypassing all of that, I've long said that, to me, the great tragedy of the Second Vatican Council was that, John the 23rd's intentions were good, to open up the church to the spirit of the times and for the purpose, though, of making, helping the church be more understandable to the world, to helping the church and the gospel be more accessible to the world, not infecting the church with the world. That was the intention.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the effect of the council in kind of blowing things open and implying this sense of anything's up for grabs meant that everything was up for grabs. And it diverted the church's energy towards decades of internal squabbling. It turned us inward. And so that our energies went to, for not only fighting, but towards obsessing about church structures and, the laity, quote, being involved in the church and creating structures to make that happen and all that kind of thing, which all culminates, the natural kind of culmination of all this is all this synodality stuff,
Yeah. Yeah.
requiring bishops to spend energy and resources on this synodal process, which should be spent on spreading the gospel and doing the works of mercy. And so that's kind of the great tragedy to me, is that the energy that was diverted from actually spreading the gospel, spreading the good news, being the presence of Christ in the world, diverted to internal squabbles. And definitely Leo, through taking this name, I think is an invitation to us to look back and to say, the late 19th century in Catholic history wasn't some ideal that we're trying to get back to, but that whole understanding and that sense of the church as the united body of Christ in the world to be the hands of Christ and be the voice of Christ and the ears of Christ is something that we need to recapture. It doesn't mean saying that all of these internal issues are irrelevant or should just be forgotten, but it just means it's a reset. It's a reset.
Yeah, it really truly is. I love that. I like that. It is a great reset. Hopefully it's a reset too for the implementation of Vatican II. I know some of my traditional readers like, oh, so over Vatican II, there have been failed councils in the history of the church, and maybe this is just one of them. It's time to get beyond it. After all, it was just a pastoral council, blah, 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 blah. The council actually remains, I think, one of the most revolutionary, in a good sense, one of the most radical, in a good sense, things to happen in the church in quite some time. In particular, the time had finally come for the universal call to holiness for all people to be emphasized. As Dorothy Day quietly and then publicly said frequently, what we need is a revolution of the heart, and what we need is a revolution amongst the laity. The problem with synodality, it seems to me, is that it wants to emphasize lay participation without emphasizing lay holiness. And those two things have to go hand to hand, and Vatican II understood this. All right, so my hope is
Right.
that Pope Leo, at implementing synodality, which, by the way, when he mentions synodality, he quickly always mentions collegiality, which is the true
Yeah.
teaching of the Second Vatican Council, shared
Right.
episcopal authority in the church between the Pope and the bishops. So I'm agreeing with you. This is an opportunity for a great reset to say, let's take a look at the council again. What were its essential features? It was the universal call to holiness in a Christocentric tonality, with a call to a more radical evangelical living of the gospel. If the juridical elements of the church were de-emphasized, it was only to emphasize the Marian subjective piety, holiness aspect of the church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think Pope Leo the 13th understood this quite well. One last thing. It was Pope Leo the 13th who made Cardinal Newman a
Right.
cardinal John Henry Newman
Right.
a cardinal. It'd be my hope that Pope Leo would make John Henry Newman a doctor of the church,
Yeah.
because I think in many ways Vatican II was reflective of many, many elements of Newman's theology. But anyway,
Hmm.
that's a
Hmm.
grab bag of differing comments, but go ahead.
No, and so as I said, I, I hate to predict and I hate to pin any specific hopes on the papacy of Leo the 14th, but the signs to me are there of a sober, reflective, and deeply pastoral, um,
Yeah.
and authentically pastoral papacy. And to me, when I think of pastoral and pastors and the papacy, one of the important features of a pastoral attitude to me is actual, true todos, todos, todos. That
Yes.
in your
Yes.
language and in the way you treat people, you don't you don't draw lines. You don't say this person or this group is less of a Christian or less of a disciple than that one. You may think it, but you don't say it and you don't treat people that
Yeah.
way. And
Yeah.
when you read, for example, just jump back to Benedict XVI, who was a very, you know, lots of people didn't like him, right?
Yeah.
Were very disappointed when he was elected. They saw him as a retrograde, throwback, and all of that kind of thing. And he had very definite views about liturgy, about the role of the church in society, and so on and so forth. But when you read what he said and wrote as Pope, there is absolutely no sense that anybody is excluded from the church or the love of God. There is no sense that he is looking at people and saying and shaking his finger. There is none of that. And I have the same vibe from Pope Leo, and
Yeah.
I'm hopeful for that.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest, is because most viewers and listeners to this podcast know, and readers of my various articles, I was no Pope Francis fanboy. And so in many ways, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact, I don't think Pope Francis was a heretic. I disagree with the rad trads in that regard. I don't think that he was all that bad in terms of his doctrinal things, a little fuzzy, a little ambiguous here and there. But I mean, let's face it, Pope Francis didn't give the liberals basically a darn thing that they ever wanted. They
Right,
didn't. He didn't
right.
give them female ordination, even to the diaconate. He didn't okay contraception. He didn't really
Mm-mm,
okay full on divorce and remarriage. He
mm-mm,
never got rid of priestly celibacy, even, which he could have done with the stroke of a pen overnight,
mm-mm.
because it's an ecclesial discipline and not a doctrine. And on and on and on it goes, that he didn't give them the things that they wanted. And so, no, I don't think Pope Francis was a heretic. I don't think doctrinally he was all that bad. What he was, however, was someone who was arbitrary, capricious. He had a temper. I think he could be vindictive. I think he was thin-skinned. I think Traditionis Custodes is reflective of essentially an almost vindictive sort of animus against those who are most critical of him. Now, I know that's very harsh and judgmental on my part, and I pray for the deceased Holy Father. But nevertheless, I think that what we have in Pope Leo is going to be a combination of the best elements of John Paul and Benedict in terms of
Mm-hmm.
their theological clarity, but
Mm-hmm.
also then the best elements of Pope Francis in terms of his
Right,
emphasis on pastoral care, going to the peripheries. I mean, my goodness, Prevost was in Peru for 20 years. He understands the peripheries. He understands
right.
the importance of that message from Pope Francis. And if I would say, what's the legacy of Pope Francis? That's it more than anything, I think.
Yeah,
His fundamental pastoral instinct that the church is a field hospital that needs to go out to the sinner. I think that was a
right.
powerful message from him. But unfortunately, as you correctly pointed out, Pope Francis's todos, todos was never complete. He never really meant that because he had enemies that he would sideline. He did. And so my hope is that with Prevost, we get an improved version of Pope Francis, and with the theological clarity of a John Paul and Benedict. That's kind of what I'm expecting and hopeful of.
I agree. And I also perhaps am hopeful that the public discourse about the papacy can maybe take a lesson from a new attitude and be less vindictive, less judgmental,
Yeah.
less tied to narrative. Because I think part of the problem that people had with Francis was not so much Francis himself, but how his person and his words were weaponized
Yes.
by others. So, for example, the whole emphasis, as you point out, the very beautiful emphasis on mercy and the church is a field hospital for the sinners, for the sick, and so on. What's untrue about that? Nothing. There's nothing untrue about that.
Yeah.
But what was problematic was people kind of taking that up and then using it to point fingers at people they deemed less merciful than they should be, and saying, see, you I don't know, you
Yeah.
are not going to celebrate, Pride Month. Oh, well, you're not, you don't believe that the church is a field hospital. You believe that it's just for saints and all of that kind of thing. No. And so that to me was one of the most annoying factors of the last 12
Well, yeah,
years.
I mean, just like his comment on the airplane, "Who am I to judge?" which was simply
Right.
about a very specific priest,
Right.
who had repented and renewed his life after accusations of homosexuality, and yet then the whole, like you just pointed out, those words were weaponized by the Catholic left against people like you and me,
Mm-hmm.
and the Vatican never clarified. The Vatican
Right.
just let that weaponized narrative stand, and that's what
Exactly.
really angered a lot of people, right?
Right. Oh, yes. And even elements, when we're talking about liturgy and liturgical elements, you know, Pope Francis very, famously eschewed a lot of, you know, traditional liturgical elements during the Mass and so on. And of course, he, had his moves against the traditional Latin Mass and so forth. But again, people using that to kind of point fingers at anybody who wants to do some chant in Mass, or a priest who wants to celebrate Ad Orientem, and using kind of that idea that they're getting from Pope Francis, that is elitist, that kind of expression
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
elitist. And so then pointing fingers and saying, well, then you are elitist. If you like that, then you're not. You're exclusive. And it was kind of crazy. But I'm hoping with this, Pope Leo's affect and the way he speaks and the way he treats people, and that can kind of calm down, that we can stop looking at each other and using Pope Francis's, or not Pope Francis, using the Pope's latest words as a way to judge our fellow Catholics. I'm tired
Yeah.
of
Oh,
that.
I'm
Yeah.
so tired of that too. And that was all throughout the Francis papacy, and that his handlers allowed his various off-the-cuff statements and stuff to be so used and so weaponized.
Mm-hmm.
That it was, I mean, it was weaponized against me. I'm sure it was weaponized against you. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
you judgmental bigot, and blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
But as I like to say, I said to people, and I even wrote, the field hospital analogy is a beautiful one, and I agree with it
Right.
completely. But a field hospital is still a hospital. It's meant to heal.
Right.
It's not a hospice. It's not a
Yeah.
hospice, okay? A
Right.
hospice, you use palliative care to ease people into their death and hold their hand while doing so,
Right.
okay? And so it seems to me the Catholic left turned the field hospital into a hospice by essentially
Mm-hmm.
saying, we're just going to leave the sinners where they are. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
leave them spiritually dead because we really don't think that their sins really are sins. It's like
Right.
saying a doctor walks into to a triage unit in a field hospital and says, well, these people aren't really sick. So let's
Right.
just, send them, let's just sit with them for a while and see what happens.
Right.
That to me, that kind of thing I think you've really put your finger on something very important, Amy, which is it's not so much Pope Francis as such. It is the weaponization of Francis Inc., the image that
Yeah.
Francis became, the
Yeah.
weaponization, you know. And so let's talk a little bit in the time we have left then about liturgy, because I think this is important because it's in many, many ways, in my opinion, the festering wound in the church that just will not get. This has been a festering wound in the church since the end of the Second Vatican Council. The liturgy wars have been ongoing now for 60 years.
Hmm.
Okay, and somebody in the papacy needs to make it stop. Pope Benedict tried to make it stop through Summarum Pontificum and
Right.
the institution of the Anglican Ordinariates, which I attend.
Yes.
Okay, in other words, Pope Benedict was not afraid of some form of liturgical pluralism. So it seems to me that one of the ways that Pope Leo could unify the church, and I hope he does, is to not just simply lift the strictures of Traditionis Custodes and maybe restore Summorum Pontificum, but to offer maybe even an encyclical or some other writing on the theology of the liturgy that then legitimates the concept of liturgical pluralism. The idea, in other words, that we have to have a single unified Roman rite without any deviations of any kind wasn't even true in the preconciliar church. There's always
Right.
been liturgical pluralism in the church. So this nonsense that you're hearing from people like Cardinal Supich or Bishop Martin in Charlotte, all right, that nobody can kneel to receive communion, no altar rails, no ad orientem, no Latin of any kind. And forget the traditional Latin Mass. Bishop Martin has even banned things in the Novus Ordo that individual
Right.
priests might want to
He's
do.
trying to. He's trying to.
And
That was a
he's
draft.
trying
Yeah.
to. And I've been
Right.
told by a priest friend of mine that's down there to steer clear of this because there are issues behind the scenes. And so
Right.
I had some stuff on Twitter and Facebook I posted, I deleted because
Mm,
we none of us knows what's really going. Okay, but
right.
on the
Right.
face of it, the rationale that Bishop Martin has given and Supich has given and others have given is, well, we have to have liturgical uniformity. No, we don't. And in point of fact, those of us talk about the generational thing, those of us who grew up in the Novus Ordo Church and the Mass of Paul VI Church understand that there's theological pluralism in the Novus Ordo as such because no Novus Ordo is ever performed exactly the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a Cirque du Soleil madness in many parishes with people just flying off the walls and liturgical trapeze acts. All right. And then you've got sort of just bare bones, just the facts, ma'am, kind of Novus Ordo liturgies.
Right.
So we've already got liturgical pluralism in the sense the church has refused to clamp down on liturgical abuses. And so I would say that in other words, you get where I'm going. So maybe you can comment on that.
Oh, I have a lot to say about
Yeah,
that.
go
I mean,
for it, girl. Go for it.
I've written extensively about this over the years, and like you, I am exhausted by it. And when you look at the history of the past 60 years, I do wonder what can be done. I mean, it can't be fixed completely, but the measures that you speak of, I think, go away towards establishing a sort of liturgical peace. And as you point out, liturgical uniformity, as kind of mandated, quote, by these bishops who want to do things like ban kneeling and so on, it's a farce because, as you point out, there is no liturgical uniformity. But I think the deeper question is these guys, these bishops or whoever, will allow variation within the liturgy within a certain parameters. But the question that comes up more and more, and I think as the older generation passes and the newer generation comes up, it's going to be asked with more intensity is, okay, if we can have that kind of liturgical variation within the Novus Order, why can't we have this? Why can't, if you can
Yeah,
tell us, if during the Mass we have to greet each other and tell each other where we're from and welcome each other, if we can inject that, why can't we inject an altar rail? What's
that's
the
right.
logical reason behind that? And there is no logical reason. It's kind of, oh, well, that's pre-Vatican II. We don't like it. Um, but I think it has to be addressed because, as I just said, the younger generations, they're not flocking to TLMs. I mean, there are a lot of them are going, but at the very least, they are interested in and expecting and drawn towards tradition. They are drawn towards mystery. They are drawn towards chant and all of that kind of thing. And moreover, a lot of them have been raised in an environment in which it's not a big deal, and that's, I think, some
That's
of the
right.
conflict in Charlotte, and I stay away from that too. But, for example, in my parish, young people who have gone to that parish their whole lives have been raised in Novus Ordo parish, but very chant heavy with, male altar servers and lots of Latin and so on. And so then they are go to another parish where that is supposedly not allowed,
Yeah.
where that is forbidden, and that makes no sense. It's irrational. It's illogical. And that to me is one of the things that has to be addressed and it's a kind of a side issue, but I think it's fundamental is it, are we actually allowed to kind of weave together these rites or to incorporate elements of them into each other? Or is the Novus Ordo stuck in 1975, determined and shaped by the views of those who, lived in 1975?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that what we're about? I'm trying to figure out how to say this without giving anything away, but I was aware of a wedding in a Catholic cathedral in the United States in which the couple had to fight tooth and nail to be allowed to have polyphony in their own Novus Ordo wedding. They had to get permission from the diocese to do this. And that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And um,
Yeah. Yeah.
the only way I think it's absolutely necessary for the sake of the integrity of our Catholic tradition, to lay down the law about this, to say, no, bishops can't ban polyphony in their cathedrals. They can't ban, if it's allowed, if kneeling to receive communion is allowed, which it is, you, chief liturgist of your diocese, you may be, cannot ban it. But then,
Yeah.
short of that, or going beyond that, as you say, peace has to be brought between the two forms, the various forms of the Mass, and this whole idea of this false liturgical uniformity. It's not authentic. It's weaponized liturgical uniformity. Has they Something has to be done.
Oh gosh, we could probably just do a whole show just on this. Something does have to be done. There's a priest in my diocese here, I won't say which my diocese is so the people can guess, who wanted to put altar rails up in his church. And
Mm-hmm.
that was vetoed by the local bishop. And once again, the grounds was liturgical uniformity. And that's just BS
Right.
because there is no liturgical uniformity. And the fact is, when they say liturgical uniformity, that's simply code for we don't want any elements of the more traditional liturgy entering into any parish in this diocese. So my
Right.
question would be, what are you afraid of? What are you
Right.
afraid of? I mean, come on, an altar rail is going to destroy the liturgy. I don't think so. Uh, so what is wrong with a little liturgical pluralism here? Allow if a parish on one street has, altar rails and the priest says mass ad orientem and there's lots of Gregorian chant and everybody receives kneeling on the tongue, but then the next parish over is, Peter, Paul, and Mary folk masses, blah blah blah, you know, then the laity have choices. All right, the
Right.
lady can in a sense say, I choose this parish over that parish, and so on. So I don't really know what the beef is, other than
Well,
it's ideological. There's
and
just
it comes down to the generational thing. I had an
yes,
exchange on Twitter last week with a younger priest who said, I just don't understand. I don't understand why people get upset about altar rails. And he was saying from the perspective of he thinks it should be okay. He said, I just don't get the hostility towards them. It makes no sense to me. And I responded to him. I said, look, in terms of the laity, you have a generation of laity, our age, Larry, and a bit older, who for 50 years or longer have been told that it was good to get rid of things like altar rails. It was good to encourage people or to even mandate people receiving standing and in the hand, because what that does is emphasize to people their dignity as adult Christians. It breaks down the division between
Yes.
laity and clergy and hierarchy, and all of that is a remnant of the medieval time anyway. And for decades, that's what people have heard. And that's why they have heard that something like an altar rail is a bad thing. So, of course, somebody, a layperson, an older layperson who comes in and sees an altar rail is going to react that way. They're going
Yeah.
to bring all of that that they have been told in good faith or bad faith or whatever to that moment and say, oh, are you telling me that I'm less? Are you telling me that I don't have my dignity as a child of God or
Yeah.
something like that?
Yeah.
And so that's I've been working really hard to try to help people understand and be able to communicate with each other across generations about these issues, because I feel that sometimes the younger people in their late 30s and under, who have been raised in kind of this orthodox milieu, which you can seal yourself in, they don't understand how we were raised, and that everything that we were taught was presented to us as just a good new Pentecost, beautiful kind of thing, and the past was done, and to kind of be confronted with, to see a priest in a cassock again is, I won't say triggering. I mean, I'm not talking about myself,
Yeah.
obviously. I'm talking about older people that I know. It's just,
Yeah.
it's startling, and they don't get it. They don't understand. Why are these girls wearing veils? We didn't, we hated doing that. We got rid of that. Why are they doing that? And again, this is something that I am confident, a dynamic and a tension that Leo lived through. And he understood, and then he understood the need. I hope that he understands the need for balance, spending decades in a more traditional, and when I say that, I don't mean in terms of traditionalism, but when you talk about as the faith is lived in a place like Peru, it is less rooted in novelty, let's put it that way, and progressive ideology, and that he
Yeah.
has come to an understanding and a balance of all of this, and that when you threw the baby out with the bathwater back in 50 years ago, you actually threw out the baby, and it's a
Yeah.
long time coming to have a reset and to bring peace to that. And I pray for him, because it's so desperately needed.
Very much so. And I think you've hit the nail on the head once again. That the differences in the liturgy and the visceral reactions to them are reflective of differences in ecclesiology.
Yeah,
What you have in an older generation in particular is a revulsion against the old clericalistic. You can go back and even read theologians like Ratzinger and Balthasar and de
sure.
Lubac writing from the 50s, talking about the need for liturgical reform because the current form of the liturgy with altar rails and all that sort of stuff
Mhm.
emphasized this very, very clericalistic church with a laity clearly subservient in this pay, pray, and obey model of ecclesiology, where what you had was an infantilized laity, very, very much so. And so they all, what when the liturgical reform happened, they initially sort of welcomed it and as a reflective of this changed ecclesiology, and I agree with that. For example, I'm not a huge fan of the old traditional Latin Mass. I'm not, for a lot of reasons. Number one, I think the Mass should be in the vernacular. I do, and I think the prayers should be prayed out loud. The canon should be out loud. I do
Mhm.
believe there should be dialogical responses from the laity throughout the liturgy, and so, but I also believe that there are elements of the old mass that the Novus Ordo, I think, wrongly got rid of, especially ad orientem worship. I can live or not live with altar rails, but I think ad orientem worship is something very important. I think the quality of the music is very, very important. A resurrection of so that's why I attend an Anglican ordinariate church because to me it combines the best of everything that I've been looking for. Mass
Right.
in the vernacular, prayed out loud with ad orientem, with altar rails and chant and incense and the whole 9 yards. And so I'm a big, in a sense, reform of the liturgy kind of guy.
Hmm.
I'm not a let's just go back to the old Latin Mass and scrap the Novus Ordo guy. I think that the Novus Ordo was improperly implemented. I think the old Mass was improperly suppressed. And I think that what we have 50, 60 years after the council is simply a church that is still in liturgical flux. And therefore, I see no problem with revisiting the issue and saying,
Right.
okay, the new mass came in around 1970, 72. We've now had a long time to think about it and reflect on its
Right.
usage. Let's take another look at it. Instead of a synod on synodality or a synod on the Amazon or a synod on young kids, let's have a synodal process of liturgical meditation and how
Hmm.
can we heal this wound. Anyway, I'm on a ramble now and we're kind of running out of time, but go ahead.
Um, yeah, and when you study the liturgical movement going back to the early 20th century, what you see is that the emphasis, I mean, there were always guys in it who were, creating new masses and writing books about what the new mass would look like. But the emphasis in the liturgical movement, especially as it was lived out with the laity in liturgical conferences and all that kind of thing, was not changing anything, but educating the laity, forming the laity in a more liturgical spirituality, because there was a concern that people were, just going to mass and hearing mass and sort of treating it as
Yeah.
a vending machine and doing the minimal, and that there was a sense of trying to engender a more holistic liturgical spirituality through and encouraging people to do things like receive communion more frequently. But that was always tied to going to confession more frequently, too. That's the thing that people sometimes forget.
Yeah.
And so if the liturgical movement had kind of continued on that vein, um, and not been taken over by those who wanted to do this sort of primitivistic, remaking of the mass and impose it on the world, I think we would have seen a very different outcome, and we would have might have even seen a quote reformed mass that was closer to what you experience in the ordinariate.
Yeah.
Um, and it's another tragedy, but I think that it's also a sign to us as people who are in the church, who observe the church, who talk about the church, to always be so careful about our visions, our plans, our projects, that the law of unintended consequences is real. And,
Yeah.
it's something that we see all the time in the church. And to me, and some people would say, oh, it wasn't unintended consequences. It was absolutely intended that this be the outcome. Well, I don't think so. In some parts of the church, it might have been. I mean, again, there's always bad actors and so on. But we see good intentions and hopeful intentions just, blown up into something destructive. And so that's why, again, keep coming back to humility in the time, humility in the moment, humility towards those who think differently from us about all of these issues. If we're actually going to be Christ in the world and be an effective witness to the gospel, we have to be realistic about human nature, realistic about human institutions, and not try to, think that our vision is going to fix everything. And so I see that in Leo. I mean, I see
Yeah.
that
I
understanding
think
of, just don't, maybe not talk so much, and maybe listen more and take everything into consideration and then act.
yeah, to be in a sense a voice of unification, which I think is just really so much needed now. An end to these endless wars. And one of the things I think that portends, hopefully in this regard, is that, the Pope's age. He's 69, and God willing, barring catastrophic stroke or heart attack or cancer,
Mhm.
which can strike you in your 70s rather easily. But barring that, if he remains healthy, we could be seeing, a papacy of 15, 16, 17, 18 years again, which gives him ample opportunity to be that unifier, that
Mhm.
pacifier of the various factions in the church. So,
And I will
anyway,
say
go
he did
ahead.
one more thing. He does strike me. One of the other words that strikes me when I watch him and listen to him is steely. And it's like strong. And
Yeah,
there's a video that's going around of one of the of an encounter he had when he was a bishop, of kind of in the midst of a crowd that had taken over a local shrine, and he was trying to reason with them about it and diffuse the situation, but he was very strong, very forceful, but not in a mean way, but very resolute. And so I'm hopeful that that is another aspect of his personality that is going to know what he do his pray, listen, and make a decision. And I'm confident. I actually have a lot of confidence that when he makes a decision, and based on what? Based on watching it for 2.5 weeks? I don't know. But that when he makes
yeah,
a decision, it's a reasoned decision. It's not out of a reaction. It's a actual
yes.
reasoned decision that he's going to stick to. And it's for the good of the church, not the good of an ideology or one agenda. It's for the good of all of us.
I agree completely. And I think that is probably the best way to end this podcast on that positive note and that positive assessment of the hope and the promise of Pope Leo. Amy, thanks for coming on the podcast. I would just keep going with this podcast another half an hour, but as I told you off camera, if you will, I have a sick baby goat that I have to take to the vet,
I know.
and I have an appointment coming up very quickly here, and the vet's an hour away because it's hard to find livestock vets.
Oh,
Most vets deal with kitty cats and puppy dogs and essentially injecting them with every vaccine known to man because that's how vets make their money.
uh,
Don't get me started on that, on the whole veterinary industry. But anyway, I do have to go. So thanks, Amy, for being on the show today.
thank you, Larry. I really appreciate it. It was a good conversation.
Thank you. And thanks, everybody, for listening. Maybe I'll have Amy back on. We'll talk more. But anyway, bye now.